Today we're going to take a little detour from the book of Acts. You may want to pull me down. It's a little hot. Sounds like volume-wise as we change the mic. So one of the things I've been hearing, I think, as I've been praying, God talk about is this idea of what you're doing today is not just about you. I've been hearing this consistent theme of the work, the education, even here the time in the church. Like, these are not things that are about just me. It's about something more that came before, but also something that comes in the future. I was reading a story back, the Kingdom of Sweden. How many of you guys love Swedish history? Anybody big fans? No, not so much? All right. So the Kingdom of Sweden, this is in 1830. Europe has just come on a couple decades of war, the Napoleonic Wars, and the Kingdom of Sweden is looking around and going, man, we need a big, powerful navy to defend ourselves, and we need a lot of trees. These are old wooden sailing ships. And they're looking around at their forests and resources going, man, we are cutting down trees faster than we can replace. We got to do something about that. Now, you know, trees take a long time to grow. So their plan is they find an island and they plant a 900-acre forest. That's a little bit larger than Central Park. Central Park's about 870 acres. And they plant a 900-acre forest of trees, start in 1830. They're done by about 1840. They don't plan to harvest these trees until 1975 to make ships. I did a little math. If we went 145 years into the future, I figure that'd be about my fifth or sixth generation out from me, great-great-great-grandchild or something. And they were making that investment in the future because they knew, at that time you needed those wooden ships, you needed something powerful, and they were saying, we're going to invest now in something that we won't see, their kids wouldn't see, their grandkids wouldn't see, great-grandkids wouldn't see, and because life expectancies weren't as great, it might have been 6 or 7 generations for them. But they were willing to do that hard work, invest in that. And I wonder sometimes, are we willing to make those investments in the hard and the long work? Because sometimes our world is telling us all about the short-term gains, isn't it? It's all about how do we find satisfaction today. That's basically every commercial you watch on TV. In 30 seconds, they're going to tell you how to solve all your problems. They got an ad, or the pop-ups on your Facebook feed, or whatever you get. There's always a solution. I am questioning, like, what am I searching that I get ads like that? Why am I getting these ads? You ever wonder, like, what have I done to get ads like this? Sometimes they're random. Maybe sometimes we have tipped off their thing. But I want us to think a little bit about this idea of legacy and a little bit of investing in future generations. I'm going to go to the book of Deuteronomy. I'm going to skip ahead on some of my notes here. Book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 4 through 15. I'm going to read that in a second. But just by context, Deuteronomy is kind of the end for Moses. He's laying down the law, he's retelling, he's giving his kind of big exit speech throughout Deuteronomy to the nation of Israel. And he's telling them things they need for the future. So Deuteronomy 6, we'll go with verses 4 through 15. Moses is saying, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. These words which I am commanding you shall be on your heart." And here in verse 7, there's some practical things he says. "You shall teach them diligently to your sons or your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontals on your forehead." So basically this idea, you're going to be wearing these things. It's going to be so obvious you're following the commands of God's. Verse 9, "You shall write them on their doorposts and on your gates." So he tells them to do all this. He's saying, hey, you're going to make the word of God so prevalent in your life, you'll never forget it. Well, then verse 10, he says, why? "Then it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you great and splendid cities." And I love this, "splendid cities which you did not build." He says, "and houses full of good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you eat and are satisfied." Then verse 12, "Then watch yourself that you do not forget the Lord who brought you from the land out of the house of slavery." See, I think sometimes we can forget and become disconnected with what comes before us, especially when times are good. It says in verse 13, "You shall fear only the Lord your God, and you shall worship him and swear by his name. You shall not follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples who surround you, for the Lord is your God in the midst of you," or in the midst of you is a jealous God. "Otherwise, the anger of the Lord your God will be kindled against you, and he will wipe you off from the face of the earth." Moses is given this command to the nation as they get ready to go in. This is this first generation. If you think about the nation of Israel, they were in slavery. So they leave slavery, they're wandering in the wilderness, and actually he's even now talking kind of the second generation because the first generation died out in the wilderness, but he's trying to tell them, you've experienced, we sang about it, the goodness of God. You've experienced these things, but you cannot forget who brought you these good things. Because, when times are good, is it easy to kind of just forget? It's kind of easy to slip away from the things that are important that got us to where we are. Be kind of like exercising. There was a season where I was a little fit, a little more trimmer, and it was good. And then I didn't exercise as well. And then I didn't eat as well. And now I don't look as good as I once did. Not that it's about that, but it slides. It's like, well, I got there, didn't I? I reached what I wanted to. Then maybe I slacked off on some of the disciplines that would have maintained it. But we're all guilty of that potentially happening, or all susceptible to that happening. Kind of like our spiritual life. We're saved, we get excited about church, we grow up in it, we pray, read our Bible, do whatever it is, but then, it's Sunday, it's kind of dark outside, it's cold, I don't have to go to church this week. Oh, I'm in a hurry, I have to read and pray, I'll do that tomorrow. And it just kind of slips and slips. And what happens is we run this tendency. So I'm borrowing this from a friend of mine. His name's Eddie Estep. He's a pastor in the Nazarene world, district superintendent actually, leading churches in Ohio. But he's given this sermon that he talks about kind of 3 generations of Christians. And we kind of have this tendency of, we can fall in one of these 3 camps. First generation, they see the power of God, they know the power of God, they live it, they experienced it, they're excited by it. You have this second generation that knows about God, that knows all these things that happened, and they kind of get complacent with it. It's just always been. God has always been. Like, if you grew up in church, it's just always been there. And I've kind of been that way. I've always been in church. I haven't known anything different. But it's been all around me. And so I could fall in this trap of kind of being a second generation where maybe I don't make it as prevalent. The problem is we're going to look at what happens to the third generation. First generation experiences God. Second generation knows about God. Then a third generation comes along that doesn't know God. We're going to talk about what that means for us in a second, but let's flip over to the book of Judges. So we had Deuteronomy, Moses is going away. We go into Joshua, and so we had the book of Joshua, conquering the land. And then if you ever read the book of Judges, it's like this spiral into an abyss. Like the nation of Israel just messes up again and again. But we can kind of see the seeds of it here, Judges. We're going to read Judges 2, 6 through 12. So it says, when Joshua had dismissed the people, the sons of Israel went each to his inheritance to possess the land. This is important here. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Verse 8, though, then Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the territory of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. All that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. And then verse 11 and 12 are concerning. It says, then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the people that were around them. And they bowed themselves before them, thus provoked the Lord to anger. Moses called it in Deuteronomy. He said, this is what's going to happen. If you don't follow God, you're going to provoke God to anger. And I think this is an important lesson to us, this idea of transition and legacy. Joshua is actually a really great leader. If you look at Joshua in his life, we don't see prevailing sin. We don't see like a David who fell, like Moses who disobeyed God. We don't see some of those mistakes. But for whatever reason, there doesn't seem to be a succession plan for Joshua. Like Moses went to Joshua, and then Joshua is just kind of assumed, I guess you must all know. It must all be good. But something happened in that transition. And I think there's something with us within families that we have to think about this. Maybe we know God. Maybe our parents knew God, came to faith, and we experienced it. And then what are we leaving for the next generation? You look at the recent history of the church, there's a lot of kids that grow up in church and then leave it. A lot of pastors' kids, a lot of families that you'd think should be in the church, but then they walk away from it. What's happening? Something's not being connected to that second generation. Remember that first generation of Israel, they were in slavery, they experienced the full power of God. Second generation, born into freedom, knows the work from their parents, This generation gets the promised land, which God talked about in Deuteronomy. So you're going to go in, you're going to get all these things which you had nothing to do with. How many of you realize so much of what goes on in your life you had nothing to do with in terms of the good things you have, in terms of the blessings? I was looking at a picture. I should have dug it out and shown it because it's kind of funny looking, but it was a picture of my wife and I's first house. We got married back in 2007, bought the house in 2008, and every piece of furniture in that house was given to us by my parents or Lauren's parents. There was not a thing we had bought or owned. But we could have gotten really, look at us, we bought a house. Look at us, we furnished a house. We did squat. We did buy the house. We made the payments. But even then, my parents, my wife's parents, they helped us get into things. They gave us money to do things. There was very little we were doing on our own. But we could have become very puffed up and prideful and forgotten all the blessings we had been given. So it's important for us in this second generation to remember what came before us. And then we got to remember how to pass it on to somebody else. So much of what I do and try to do with my kids is trying to figure out how can I connect with them. And they're 11 down to 3 years old. And I'm going to say there's not been terribly serious, deep conversations. Like I go out with them. I take them to donuts once a week. I take them for birthday breakfasts every year. Go out and do other random things. They're 11 to 3. There's not these great, deep theological conversations about life that are happening yet. What I'm trying to do, give my secret away. Fortunately, well, they might be listening today. I'm going to give them my secrets. They're paying attention. I'm trying to plant seeds in their lives. I want it to be so natural that us going out and having a conversation, because when they're 13, 14, 15, it might feel awkward. Not if we've been doing it their whole life. So I'm planting seeds, kind of like the Kingdom of Sweden plants those seeds for 145 years. I'm planting seeds that I hope get harvested in a few years. I did the math. I think it's 449 days until we have a teenager in our house. Yeah. It's coming. These kids are going to grow up. And actually, I'm excited about that. I know some parents are always like, oh, I like them when they're little. I think my wife may be more like that. But I'm like, no, let them grow up. I want to see them as adults. That's who I want to interact with. But I want to interact with God-fearing adults who are walking in the ways of Jesus. And so for myself, I could be very tempted to skip church. In fact, I was for a season, the last couple of years, especially after COVID. Anybody else feel disrupted after that? And it was such a habit beforehand that it was like, it's automatic. We just go to church on Sunday. COVID happened. We had about 9 weeks where church just didn't happen. And then once it came back, it's like, we could go, or we could not. The couch is pretty comfortable. I'm going to admit I was not very good at watching live streams in that era. I just didn't. I was like, this isn't very good. I'm not interested. Maybe that's a bad attitude. And I'm not saying it was anybody's fault. That was just me. I just didn't watch a lot. And so for most of 2020, it was kind of hit and miss. But even in 21, 22, 23, I find myself like, I got a work trip. I'll just leave on Sunday. I'll just get there a day early. Or I can take a little extra vacation time. We can come back Sunday afternoon. It's no big deal. Well, it doesn't matter. And in some ways, for my wife and I, as adults and mature believers, no, it doesn't necessarily going to derail us, though it does eventually. It's a lie. I think, Pastor Kurt, you were talking about this last week, this idea of a ship getting off course. It'll derail you. But the reality is I have to think about the example I set for my kids. I wish my kids were not watching me all the time. How many of you feel that? I'm like, go look over there for a second. I'm going to go do my thing and misbehave, and then you can watch me again. But they are watching. They are looking for me for an example, for a cue, and so we have to give them that. So all the things we do, the habits, the routines, so much of what I'm doing now, it's not really for me anymore. I want them to walk with God one day. I've had a prayer I've said since my kids were little when I put them to bed, though none of them apparently really need me to put them to bed anymore. Unless Mommy's home, then they'll let her put them down. I'm like, wait a minute. I'm not that important at bedtime, it appears, but that's all right. But I've had a prayer I've always said over them if I put them to bed or if I'll just say it anyways when they're going to bed, but it's idea that there's two things I want for them in life. And I've not done the whole pray for their spouse thing. Like, I don't know, anybody do that? I don't know. It was a thing for a while. At least when I was growing up, I was like, we're praying for future spouses, this and that. I'm like, whatever. They get married or don't get married. That's not the thing I'm most worried about for them. I've always prayed that they would have the fruit of the Holy Spirit. Pray that love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness would flow from their heart to everyone that they meet. And I pray that they would follow Jesus and that they would do his will each and every day. If they do that, the spouse thing will be taken care of. I don't have to worry about the spouse. If they'll do those things, they will attract something that is great in that. So I'm not worried about those things. So our presence in life, all the things we're doing, attending church, prayer, the Bible studies, all these things set an example. Because our world right now, if you haven't noticed, I was looking, Declan, my son, he wants to play flag football. You have to be a little older, so I told him they're waiting. But I'm looking at leagues, and one of them was like, oh yeah, every Sunday in the afternoon. I'm just like, no. I'm not picking that one. There's other options. Now, there may be times we miss church for stuff. That's fine, but I'm not going to sign up for it regularly when he's 5, 6, or 7. I'm not going to show him the priority of sports. I'm going to show him the priority is church. You know, I know it's hard sometimes having kids here in worship, but we're setting an example for them. I remember, what's funny, I remember growing up in church, probably 4 or 5 years old. We moved to the Northland. The first church we were at there, we not only had, the kids, we were in worship. You think it's a little weird to walk down to the building over there? Let me tell you the story. When I was at church, not only would we be in a separate building, we would get on a bus and drive to a different part of the property. How do you like that for just, Mark probably remembers, we were there at church together back in the day. It was funny because it was the pastor's twin brother that was driving the bus, and so if you go far enough back, you know who it was. But it was funny, but we'd get on a bus and drive to a different part of the property. But we were in worship together. I don't know when that stopped. I don't remember specifically when that happened. Eventually we had full children's church, and that's all fun and good. I don't have any knock against that. But at least for the time being, we want the kids in here so they can worship, so they can participate. Yeah, they're a little noisy sometimes, but you know what? They've got to learn and be discipled somewhere. If we don't do it here and now, when will they be? Because then they'll just be, I don't know, what it'll be, 11, 12, 13, whenever age out of kids ministry, come into church and they're like, what do I do now? Because they hadn't seen it. Offer you an encouragement if you want to flip forward to John 15, 1 through 8. I'll work towards wrapping this up here in a minute. Jesus said, I am the vine and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes so that it may bear more fruit. Let's skip down. Here's the verse I want. Verse 4 there, John 15, 4. Abide in me and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in me, so neither can you unless you abide in me. Oh, there's verse 5. I am the vine and you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. I'd used that verse a while back. It's this idea that we need to be connected to Jesus. If we want to leave a family legacy, we have to be connected to Jesus. I have these 3 Bibles up here. This will be my last illustration, and then we'll start to wind down here. What's fun about these 3 Bibles, this one belonged to my grandpa, my dad's dad. This one belonged to my dad, and this one belongs to me. And I have several Bibles from my dad and me, and just the one from my grandpa. My grandpa had passed away back in 2016, Dad this year. But what's significant about these is these represent the 3 Bibles we each had while we were in seminary and studying. So the first one dates back to 1973, when my grandfather started seminary, and then finished in 1975. I was realizing that next year will be 50 years since he graduated seminary. My grandfather was not a Christian before being saved. He was in the Air Force, got saved in Vietnam by a chaplain, actually a Baptist chaplain in Vietnam. Came back, got in a Baptist church in Buffalo, New York. And then I don't know all the history of this. I need to ask my aunt. She could probably tell me more. She was around for it all. But for some reason, he decided to go from Buffalo, New York, all the way down to Arlington, Texas, or Fort Worth, I guess, and go to seminary for 2 years. He didn't have any education. He was an immigrant from Yugoslavia. But he decided to take time, invest, and go to school. He got a certificate program. It wasn't even a full degree because he didn't have any other degrees. But he got that education and then spent the next 35 years planting and pastoring churches. My dad did a lot of that too. And so there's something here to where if we look at the generations, we got 3 generations. You know, my grandfather, he did that, and then my dad somehow picked it up. He planted probably 4 or 5 churches. It was with churches that planted and spent his whole career working with churches. 2018, he graduated seminary. In about 3.5 weeks, 2.5 weeks, I need to start counting. I get to graduate seminary finally. Well, my doctorate, I've had other stuff, but it'd be fun that all 3 of us will have graduated, actually from Baptist seminaries. There's a rich heritage there. But you know, I was curious about the history of that. So somebody somewhere made it possible for my grandfather to go to seminary when he didn't have any education. That was Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I look back, I was curious, where are the roots of that? That seminary started in 1908 by a pastor named B.J. Carroll. So I looked at B.J. Carroll. I said, what's his history? Funny, he was saved in 1865 after the Civil War at a Methodist revival. I thought that was interesting. The Methodists come from John Wesley. John Wesley organized the Methodists in 1743. And part of why John Wesley organized the Methodists was something Martin Luther wrote in a commentary in 1515. I can trace all this back to those who came before us. There's this lineage in history, and there'd be 100 other things if we traced all the roots and branches, but all of us come from something. Somebody shared the gospel with us. I do remember the day my dad shared the gospel with me. I remember when he told me what it was to be saved, and I remember a couple nights later making that decision. So we've got these legacies, but my dad, for whatever reason, he did not transition to just a second generation. He kept pressing in. He kind of stayed first generation. And I've got a choice. Do I just accept all the good things that Dad left for me and did for me? He built a business. I get to inherit that and just, cool, I'll coast. I'm good. Nice and easy, just ride out the blessings. And I could do that. I could just be there enjoying it. But really the question is, what comes after me? I have 4 kids. I hope to someday see grandkids. I hope to see great-grandkids or however long the Lord lets me live. But I want there to be a legacy in generation. I told Declan someday he'll get those 3 Bibles. He's like, okay, what's that mean? He's 5. He doesn't know. Someday I'll explain that history and that family to him. Lauren, you can come up. We'll start to wind down. But we have this idea. I want to talk about this idea of leaving a godly legacy. We have to remain connected to what came before us. We cannot abandon. There's so much in our world today that tells us to abandon the past. I hear stories that in my mind are flat out demonic of people cutting off families and doing things and just really evil things in this world. But it's this enemy is coming to attack the family. If you go back to Genesis, first 2 chapters, God says, be fruitful and multiply, and then he talks about, for this reason, a man and wife shall be joined to one flesh. These are fundamental verses, and yet the enemy is trying to destroy the family. I don't know if you noticed that. That's not unintentional. That's on purpose that the enemy's out to destroy, kill, steal, and destroy. But the fundamental verses in Genesis there, the devil's going after. So to be in a legacy, we have to remain connected to what came before us, but we also have to live with the future in mind. It can't just all be about today. Living for today is easy. I'm tempted to fall into that. I'm tempted to not get up and go for a walk in the morning because I'm tired. But ideally, in 20 or 30 years, I'd like to still be able to get up and go for a walk in a mile and it not, break my hip or something. I'd like to still be fit. I play with my kids. I hope to play rough with my grandkids someday. So I do little things like that. I eat better than I used to. I don't eat perfect, but again, it's for a future. So we have to make decisions today. Again, like that Kingdom of Sweden, planting a forest that they wouldn't touch for 145 years. Now, it's funny, we have to remember, not everything that we plant, we get to control the harvest. It's funny that, and probably from the time they finished that forest, probably 30, 40 years, wooden ships were obsolete. It was all steel, steam, and then diesel, and now nuclear, and all changed. So now the forest is used for other things, including building replica wooden ships of that era, which is kind of funny. But oak barrels, furniture, veneers, there's a lot of uses coming out of it, but stuff they never envisioned. So sometimes we get to plant seeds, we won't see the result, but God has so many wonderful things for them. And so it's good for us to invest in that. I just want to encourage you, it's so important to raise our kids to follow Jesus. If we look at the world and go, wow, it's crazy and out of control, well then let's do something about it. Let's plant some seeds that will someday bear fruit. I do hear from time to time this idea that, I'm so worried what the next generation will have. I'm so worried about this and that. And I hear it, and I agree. Maybe it will not be as good as the past, but that's okay because God's still in control. We can still trust God with our future and with our kids. We're going to take communion here in a second, and there's some things I want to think about with that. And I realize I may not have the verse pulled up. I'll get it here in my thing in a second. But when Jesus talked about communion with his disciples, he talked about do this in remembrance of me when he broke the bread. And he talked about the cup. This is the future covenant. Right there, he's talking about remembering the past and embracing the future covenant. So let's take a moment. If you want to grab the elements, I think they're ready in the back there, and then come back, have a seat, and we'll take communion together here.